Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the blockchain panel. We're lucky to have three leading global authorities on blockchain, but just to start off, who here is familiar with blockchain? Pretty good. Who here thinks blockchain is overhyped? All right, let's see if this panel changes some minds. We're very lucky to have perhaps the world's leading blockchain evangelist, Alex Tapscott. You and your dad have sort of literally written the book on it. So we'll start with you. Why should companies care about blockchain?
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the Fortune Global Forum for having me. The reason that blockchain is important to you as business leaders is because it represents the second era of the internet. So for about 30 years, we've had this thing, the Internet of Information, and it's been this really powerful tool that's allowed us to basically transform how we move, store, manage, and organize information. But it actually hasn't had as big an impact on assets because it's an information medium. So when you want to move, store, manage assets on the internet, you still have to rely on intermediaries, middlemen, to establish trust. And what blockchain does is it reduces the need for intermediaries in certain types of transactions by allowing you to basically move assets peer-to-peer. And that represents a big sea change in how we think about the economy. All of a sudden, regardless of whether you're in financial services or in manufacturing or in media or healthcare or even in government, it opens up all sorts of new use cases for you to deliver more value to customers, to change how you do business, and to open up new markets and opportunities that were basically previously unavailable.
Okay, yeah, and I think we've heard this for a few years, and that's the theory, the sort of disruptive thing, peer-to-peer, get rid of middlemen. But Julia, in your case, you have CEOs coming to you saying, do I actually need this thing? What do you tell them?
Well, first of all, we absolutely agree that it's a very important technology. It's one of our strategic growth initiatives. We have deep expertise, but our role is to help companies think about whether to implement and when. So we start with two very simple pieces of advice. The first is, if you're a CEO and someone is coming to you with a blockchain project, beware, because blockchain is a technology, not an outcome. And while it's ripe for experimentation and pilots, it has to start with what's the business challenge or opportunity. It needs to be business-led in partnership with technology and have a clear ROI. So for example, we worked with DHL around the counterfeiting of drugs. Clear problem, 1 million people a year die from counterfeit drugs. Blockchain is part of a solution with a single source of truth, big opportunity. But the point was, it started with a problem, and the solution has blockchain, but also people and process. And then the second piece of advice is, once you understand what the potential use cases are and how it might help, the question to ask is, should you be a first mover, or should you monitor and participate? And today, given the state of the industry, the technology, and the complexity, for most companies, the answer is still going to be monitor and participate as opposed to be a first mover. And we can get into the criteria we use, but at the very high level, that's where we start the conversation.
All right, well, Christine, let's put it to you, because you're at JP Morgan, and your boss most famously is perhaps the world's biggest Bitcoin skeptic. He called it a fraud, and we know Bitcoin and blockchain aren't the same thing. And yet,
he said he loved the blockchain. He said the blockchain is real.
Okay.
So God bless the blockchain.
Okay, he still doesn't like Bitcoin. But I also think it's very cool, and Fortune's done a lot of reporting on this, how JP Morgan's actually been innovating on this. You've had this sort of skunkworks project building out your own form of blockchain. So can you sort of tell us where we're at with that?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm really excited to be here in Canada. Fun fact is that Public Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, who created Public Ethereum, is Canadian, and it was created here. I think Minister Baines this morning is talking about the openness of the culture and driving business forward here. Like, I think that mindset here in Canada around having like a risk tolerance to innovate, to enable progress, definitely appreciate being here and being in this forum. So thanks for having me. From JP Morgan's perspective, our blockchain program has been in existence for 3 years now, which is dog years in like blockchain land, and especially enterprise blockchain. I think we were one of the first, in addition to Accenture, to get involved in it. And so we've definitely learned a lot of lessons, and I think that we've definitely matured in how we think about blockchain. Certainly, in the beginning, it was what you said, which was it's going to change the world, it's going to disintermediate everyone, and banks and clearinghouses and everything. And I think that now we've kind of come to this next level of maturity where we kind of think of it more, less as disruption, but more as transformation, which I've heard thematically is how people think about it, digitization broadly overall here. And so for our part, what we really focus on are the business problems. So like what Julie had said, we really anchor ourselves with each of the different heads of the lines of businesses to understand what is their overall business strategy and priority, and what are their pain points. And then from there is blockchain a technology that may help solve any of those problems or create new businesses, et cetera. One example of this is how we worked with our treasury services team. Early on, 3 years ago, because of the Bitcoin origins, everyone was like, oh, blockchain, totally going to disrupt payments, global payments, like, let's get it on the blockchain. And we looked at it, and we spent time with our treasury services team, both on the business side and the tech side, to look at what does payments look like on blockchain. And I think everyone was a little bit bewildered because from a clearing and settlement standpoint, the actual mechanism of clearing and settling a payment, a cross-border payment, works just fine. And whatever incremental optimization that a blockchain could enable, like when stood up against the business case of having to retire legacy systems and migrate off and build an entirely new system, like just didn't really make sense. And so we had to step back and think, like, what are the actual issues here in treasury services? Realize that the correspondent bank network have a real everyone had like a real issue with the exchange of sanction screening information, where in a cross-border payment from one country to another, the payment instruction passes through like a daisy chain of correspondent banks. Sometimes it just gets stopped in the middle because a bank in the middle says like, oh wait, I need additional information about like the ultimate receiver. Who has that information? Then it's like telephone calls, emails, back up the chain, like who has the information, I'm waiting. Something that can take a couple days or a couple weeks even. What we sought to do was create a peer-to-peer blockchain network for these correspondent banks to essentially exchange this information directly and in a controlled environment, a controlled and secured environment. And we're really excited. We actually got this project to production, which is no small feat in itself for any of you who know about enterprise-grade technology. Just announced putting that into production 2 weeks ago with 90 banks signed up. So really excited about that. We could talk a little bit more.
Okay, yeah. So it sounds like first thing to do, let's find out if there's an actual problem there, because
Yep.
I think a lot of people are saying blockchain is a solution in search of a problem. And but it sounds like once you do identify that pain point, and we hear it most commonly in supply chains, financial settlement. Next step, though, you got to go out and buy yourself some blockchain. And I don't know about you, I've never bought blockchain, even though I write about it all the time. So where do you get you some blockchain? Do you want to help us with that?
Well, Alex, why don't you start there, and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, well, sure. So I actually wouldn't mind just responding briefly to the comments that were made earlier. On the first mover versus tracking and following, it is definitely a difficult challenge that I think a lot of business leaders have. And that's because it's early enough in this industry that we're not even sure what use cases might still emerge. If you were in the CEO's seat in 1994, you might conclude that the internet, for whatever it was a medium for publishing information, and that if you were in, let's say, the newspaper industry or the media business, that it might affect you. Funnily enough, most leaders in those businesses did ignore it. But I don't think Sears Roebuck at the time was concerned about the internet, and then obviously a week ago they just went bankrupt. So I think it's important that you make it real in the enterprise. I think it's important that you pilot, that you experiment, and that you develop a strategy. I think it's useful to think about what those specific narrow use cases might be, but it's also helpful to take a step back and understand what blockchain could represent down the road. And on the crypto versus blockchain debate, the Bitcoin bad, blockchain good, it's sort of a common way of thinking about it. I think it misses the point slightly, which is that Bitcoin's not bad. I mean, Bitcoin is actually the best use case developed so far of the blockchain. It's a way for people to move value in this native digital asset peer-to-peer. And it's being used all over the world by millions of people. But what it represents is more significant, right? Rather than a speculative asset or a medium of exchange is the underlying technology. So
We're going back into theory here, though. I would like to bring it back to business
practices. I'm about to bring it back
Yeah.
to business practices. So for example, 2 weeks ago, or last week, or no, a few days ago, sorry, Fidelity just announced the launch of a separate division inside of their organization that's going to deal exclusively with these crypto assets. Now, I don't think that Fidelity believes that Bitcoin poses any risk to their business or that it's even really relevant. I think what they're actually making a bet on is that, well, if this underlying technology can work for tokens and for currencies, then it can probably work for the assets that they actually do deal in, which is things like stocks and bonds. Fidelity indirectly or directly touches about $7 trillion of assets, either directly under management or through affiliations or administration. The whole value of this crypto world is about 200 billion, so it's less than 3% of their assets. So they're not seeing this as something that's going to change their business today. They're looking at how it might change it down the road. So I think that's a useful example of how you can begin to think about this, which is to understand that at certain points, these technologies and legacy businesses will converge in a way that when we talk about trading shares in a company, we're not going to be talking about clearinghouses and cages and custodians and even exchanges necessarily. Stocks and other financial assets will be digital bearer bonds or digital bearer instruments that trade peer-to-peer in a few seconds rather than a few days. So I do think that it's important to begin to think about that stuff. So that'll start with that.
Yeah, well, I think, so first you have to say what's the criteria for, just in a very practical way, what's the criteria of when I should pilot or experiment, right? So there's 4 basic criteria. Is your use case data intensive, right? So is it, does the data have high value, like in the counterfeiting of drugs example, or in efficiencies, where you've got, say, in the supply chain, where you have your average good takes 20 different documents to be transferred. 70% of the data in those documents is replicated. The third is, are there multiple parties? If your end user to get to your end user, it's 2 or 3 parties, blockchain doesn't make sense. And then your fourth is, what's your position in your industry or ecosystem? Do you have the leverage? Because the big challenge with blockchain is that you have to have the alignment of a lot of parties. Once you say, okay, it meets the criteria, right, then how do you get some blockchain, right? It's like most problems today, it's an ecosystem. So we see 3 big areas with real promise. One is financial infrastructure. So yesterday, you may have seen the DTCC put out a report that they worked with Accenture with the support of Digital Assets and R3, 2 technology companies where you can get some blockchain, that demonstrates that blockchain today can actually support, it's the first time, the US equity market's trading about 115 million trades a day. So 6,300 trades per second, right? So financial services infrastructure is an important area. Supply chain, but going back to the criteria, if you're a small supplier, you're not doing blockchain, you're gonna participate, right? So supply chain, and the third is identity. And then once you've meet the criteria, you're in a focus area, then you have to partner. And you're gonna have, the challenges of the industry is today there are multiple protocols. It's not clear yet where things are gonna shake out. You've got the new entrants, you have platforms, major companies like Microsoft building it in. And so it goes to this need to pilot, experiment, and to be watching to some extent, where this shakes out.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to add a point around the buying of the blockchain part. You don't have to buy blockchain all the time. Actually, a lot of the blockchain protocols that are available out there for people to use are open source, right? So, in fact, at JP Morgan, a couple of years back, we were experimenting with public Ethereum. For those of you who are not in-depthly familiar with public blockchains, the concept there is that it's full transparency. All of the data that gets put on the blockchain is replicated globally. Which is fine for kind of use cases where people don't trust each other, so they trust the technology. In enterprise, data privacy is of the utmost importance, right? Client data, transaction data, needs to be private. Can't have this on an open ledger, however optimal of an experience that it can enable. And so what we wanted to do was basically leverage the great work that was already being done by the Ethereum developer community and basically add data privacy. It's a project named Quorum. And then for the first time in the history of the world at JP Morgan, we spent an enormous amount of resources developing something, and then we gave it away for free. We open sourced it. So there's actually a GitHub where you can go, your teams can go and check it out and noodle with it. There's no enterprise version that we're gonna license you for later, et cetera. It's totally through and through open source. We were talking yesterday about how I think that JP Morgan as a house is very inclined towards open source because we think that open source and standards are, if we're gonna re-platform everything, it would be great to re-platform on protocols that enable more competition between tech vendors, rather than being owned up and down a stack or value chain by like one specific tech vendor, 10 years migration off to 10 years migration onto a new one, would be a great opportunity to basically foster an ecosystem of innovation, competition, which ultimately for consumers of technologies like ourselves at large corporates means better products at a cheaper price.
I find this open source question really interesting, especially a bank which has to care about security more than any other industry. The fact you're using open source is remarkable, but what's out there in terms of the products? As you were also saying yesterday, a lot of the open source stuff, there's a company that's looking for it to lock you into a 3-year subscription and stuff like that. How do you navigate that if you're a company?
I think it just depends on what your, well, like I said, I mean, there are certainly like open source options at the protocol level. I think that obviously to drive progress in anything, like you need there is like proprietary thought in application. So the way to think about it is blockchain at the protocol level, no one's probably going to make money there, so that should be open source. And then the applications, like the businesses or the business like value that sits on top of these blockchain protocols, could be proprietary and should like contain value. So I definitely don't want to make it sound like kumbaya, like everyone's building blockchain applications for free. Like we're definitely not doing that. And then for our part at JP Morgan, the way that we think about it is, the value for us is really at the application level, like the logic of how do I make a better client experience, how do I create a new market, how do I enable like more streamlined settlement of something or another, not necessarily at like, sort of what I guess the broader community can think of as like the OS layer of blockchain.
Yeah, and to that point, we have to make sure we don't veer back into technology versus the outcome you're driving, because the technology part of it is only part of the solution. The application requires a change in culture, a change in process. It very importantly requires a completely different business model on how you're working with your ecosystem. And so, going into sort of blockchain, it's much less about the technology piece of it, but the entire solution. And that's why one of the things Christine started with about this question around return on investment. In your case, it's not that blockchain couldn't have helped with payments. It's just that when you take like a lot of what blockchain does today, companies are already doing. And so the question is, what's the net return, right? What is that much better rather than simply going with what you're having? And that's just standard prioritization, making sure you've got a strong business case. But we see, in terms of lessons learned, a lot of people saying, like, doing experiments on the shiny objects without the kind of rigor that Christine talked about.
I'd just like to jump in one sec with the notion of culture and this is a whole new paradigm we're supposed to embrace. And what this is familiar to me is when the internet came along in my industry, in media. It's like, okay, we need to put this thing on the internet. So what we did is we took PDFs and put them online, which is fine, but that's you're kind of missing the point in a sense. Right. So how do you kind of introduce a culture and make people care about blockchain and reap the benefits from it?
Well, I'll start with that. One of the organizations that we founded is the Blockchain Research Institute, which counts as its members about 50 Fortune 500 companies, including Accenture, who is a founding member. So yes. Thank you very much for that. Our goal is to basically understand, how to implement blockchain in the enterprise and to help and to enable companies like Accenture and others to do that right. And on the culture thing, I think the biggest thing that people need to realize is that blockchain is a team sport. It's one of those things that benefits from network effects. And I keep going back to financial services only because that's where I spent my formative years. If anyone's familiar with a Bloomberg terminal, if you're the only person in the world with a Bloomberg terminal, it's not as effective. If everyone has one, then it can be used as a communication tool, a trading tool, and all those other things. With blockchain, if you're the only bank that's using it for something, then it's not helpful because the whole market hasn't evolved. And
and don't do that because, by the way, if you're going to have, I think the best use case for blockchain, just really simply, is where you have multiple participants who may not necessarily trust each other entirely, operating on a shared set of data. If you're looking at a use case that is like all internal only, just use a centralized database because it's faster, cheaper, easier to implement, that's totally fine.
Yeah, so it's such a good example. Like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs don't trust each other completely. I mean, they're competitors in a marketplace.
They love each other.
But they trust each other enough to know that they're not going to undermine the very system they're working on because that would be self-defeating, right? So it's about building this shared infrastructure and figuring out what use cases make sense and then getting everyone to get on board. And I'm not in that position. You are, Christine, and I'm sure there's a lot of challenges.
And I love that you said shared infrastructure, because like in the enterprise space, people are always kind of thinking it like, you think about use cases specifically, but if you take a step back, it's shared infrastructure, like operations, post-trade. These things are not what make a business, right? Like the business value is driven off of like the client engagement, the solutioning, the advising, the creation of financial products, all the stuff that needs to happen in the back end, like the ledger keeping, the reconciliation, the operations, like that. I think everyone feels okay with sharing because it's just cost.
Yeah.
It also goes back, Jeff, though, to who should be the first mover. I mean, it's no accident that you have the DTCCs of the world, the stock exchanges. In supply chain, there's 4 major global shipping companies, and there's use cases happening by them. In retail, it's Walmart, right? So the culture and the adoption is going to be driven by the types of first movers. And the types of first movers, if you go back to my 4 criteria, the 4th was who has the position, the credibility, the influence in their industry and ecosystem to solve the biggest challenge, which is alignment among participants who may or may not completely otherwise be aligned.
I agree. We think about that. Yeah. We think about like, can we drive adoption? Can we drive network effects? Yeah.
I've got a few more questions, but I'd be curious if anyone in the audience does too. Are you buying this? Does everyone want to run out and get some blockchain when you go home today? Like, so,
not everyone needs a blockchain.
Yeah. Sir, there, please.
Says the blockchain person.
Thanks. So, yeah, we're a leader in traceability, so we know well about blockchain and we're connected to it. So, every morning when I watch the news, especially the tech news, I'm always stressed. What will happen tomorrow? Technology are going much faster than we are. And my worry about blockchain is quantum computing. Blockchain transactions rely on a key. Quantum computing is already available online. So you can have programmers working on quantum computing that are out somewhere. So what's the risk do you view with quantum computing being able to decode those private keys that will either falsify a transaction into blockchain, just ruin the system again?
I'll start. So quantum computing is something that I find really fascinating, and it's an area where, like blockchain and AI, Canada is a leader, and I'm hoping that it's successful because it could unlock unknown troves of really amazing things. At this point in time, it's something that I think about, but it's not at the top of the list. I actually think that there are bigger and more pressing implementation challenges to making blockchain real than the concern about being able to not build quantum-resistant blockchains. I think that there are questions around scalability. Can we take this technology and scale it so that it meets the demands of commercial use cases? Can we build, change our regulations in a way that enable and foster innovation? One of the things the U.S. did really well in the early 90s was develop a framework for the internet, which allowed the U.S. to become a leader, one of the reasons it became a leader. There are questions about how incumbents are going to react. There are questions on how you govern this big, messy, open source thing. And ultimately, when we look at this, these challenges, and they're very real, we dedicated a whole chapter in the book to them. They're called showstoppers. We basically asked, are these reasons that this is a bad idea, that we shouldn't be doing this, or are they challenges that we should try to overcome? And the reason we should try to overcome them is because there's an opportunity here, not just to make things more efficient and simple and straightforward, but also to make the world potentially more fair and open place by broadening the franchise for financial services, helping people secure their identity, creating new models for content creators to get paid, and other sort of important use cases. So I acknowledge the concern, and I think it's a real one, but that's something that I think will be solved over time. And at this point in time, it's not something that should stop any of you from getting interested in it. And from those of us who are in the industry, it's one of many challenges that you need to overcome. And I think that's true of any important innovation in history.
Do you two feel the same way? I think that's a good question. Quantum computing basically can attack the underlying cryptography and mess with the sacred ledger of Bitcoin or any other blockchain-based system. Is this something that sort of you talk to clients about or worry about?
I mean, in my opinion, quantum computing, like if that comes to be, we've got bigger problems than like our blockchain, right? Because that means breaking encryption for everything that exists like in prevalence today that we interact with, including the internet. So it's not just the blockchain that we're working on for sanction screening or capital markets that we're incubating. It's literally everything at large. So, but it's acknowledged that the technology that we build have to be future-proofed. And so, not to bring it back to quorum again, but we thought about that, and that's why we don't actually put encrypted data on the blockchain that gets replicated across the network, so that in the case of that encryption being broken, it's not that any of the data would be free or basically accessible. Like essentially, we keep it in a private data store. So we do try to think about being future-proof, but yeah, we'll definitely have bigger problems at that point. So
a very reputable, just to jump on that, like a very reputable senior person in the AI world said, if I build if my quantum computer really works, like I'm not hacking Bitcoin, which at the time was worth like $5 billion. It's like I'm hacking the U.S. stock market. It's worth 15 trillion, right? So.
Well, I just want to say that I wake up every day and I read Fortune data sheet, and I'm very excited about technology as opposed to stressed. So to go on the record, one of the things we haven't touched on is the potential for blockchain for new business models. And so we often talk about efficiency, data security, and privacy being part of blockchain. But where we don't really know where we're going is what blockchain will be able to enable in terms of new business models. So think about artificial intelligence, where data is the fuel for AI. Today, the data sits for an end-to-end transaction in multiple companies. With blockchain, you're going to have a single source of data that's secure that today you can't access because it's all in different places. We haven't really even begun to explore what will that mean in the world of artificial intelligence and the new types of business models when you start with a very different beginning that today is actually not possible. So I think there's a lot that's going to come in blockchain, and a lot of reason to be optimistic and excited. But going back to grounding, we've got to remember it's an emerging technology, the industry is not yet mature, and we have to solve this small problem about getting alignment among participants.
Great. I think we have another audience question.
So just to build on the quantum computing, today we have the quantum computing solving traffic flow optimization in Beijing, traffic factory optimization for Denso, financial portfolio optimization for Oak Ridge National Lab. British Telecom is using quantum computing for optimization of cell phone network problems. Also, machine learning, material science, and collection of other things, including fraud and intrusion detection. This is the prototype's business use case with the quantum computing. So it's already in the play.
So is that a blockchain question or?
No.
So I just wanted to bring it back to what Julie was talking about in terms of like the new markets, the green space, the opportunities. So I think I mentioned at the top of this conversation that, on the payments use case, the business case of taking down like a legacy system, building a new one, I get most excited about and spend most of my time thinking about the green space. Like, where is there no existing financial infrastructure where this technology can enable new infrastructure, new markets, potentially provide liquidity to illiquid markets. And we talked a little bit about public blockchain versus enterprise blockchain. I get really excited about monitoring the public blockchain space because I think that, well, first of all, like there's unbridled innovation happening there, right? Like literally, like if you have an idea, you're technologically savvy, like you can basically bring a concept to reality in just a few days or weeks, et cetera, deploy it to public Ethereum, and then you've got like a real live like production application. May not be production grade, but it's production. Like it's in the world, it's in the wild, and it's global. And because of that, that's kind of spurred a lot of exciting activity. So I'm not sure if like this crowd knows, but at the end of 2017, $7 billion was raised in this alternative universe that was like outside of the traditional financial system through what people were calling token sales or initial coin offerings. And a lot of them, there were questions about regulatory compliance, and some were fraudulent, and definitely it was an opportunity for fraudsters to like try to take advantage of investors that weren't familiar. But some of the ideas that came out of that unbridled innovation were really exciting. Like, for example, like structuring financial instruments to drive, or to basically drive incentives to like help enable specific behavior that you'd want like a network to have. Like basically the use, or like the more optimal use of like an asset across like a community of participants, as opposed to like everyone just owning like their own computer, people just sharing like their compute power. So from an enterprise standpoint, we certainly cannot have that level of uncontrolled innovation, like very controlled in terms of how we innovate and making sure that we do everything the right way, that that we are protecting our clients, that everything is cyber secure, and all the things and all the people that I need to get approvals from to do things, which I'm very happy about because I'm doing things the right way. But I love to take inspiration from what's happening in the public space to get to the next stage of transformation that Julie was talking about in terms of like I think you talked about journalism and the internet and just putting the PDF like onto the internet. Like I think that maybe in enterprise we're kind of at this stage, we're at this pivot point where we've put regular financial instruments on a blockchain or regular processes on a blockchain, but now we're at the stage of like what's next? Like what is this going to enable? Like what's the next stage that's going to be exciting and new and transformative that we haven't seen before, quite like how the internet
and building on that, innovation's been a theme here at Fortune's conference, and also we've heard what governments can do. The Canadian government with this cluster program, partnering industry and academics and stuff like that. Is blockchain work for that model? I mean, some things are best if the government just leaves it the hell alone. Sometimes it's good if it gets in and regulates it or helps it. But Alex, you've sort of done the world tour of these things. What's the role of government in this?
I think that there are a lot of things that go into creating an innovation cluster, or a center for innovation. It's not just that you have good government, or that you have a big VC community. It is those things, but it's lots of other things. You need to have a critical mass of talent. You need to have a pipeline of good students coming out of good universities. You need to have a culture of innovation and capitalism and free enterprise. I think what the Canadian government's doing around some of these core areas like blockchain, or I should say more around AI and quantum, is great. And I think that these are R&D heavy. They're front-end loaded on the amount of money you need to spend to actually develop them. And that contribution has been critical to help establish Canada and Toronto and its surrounding areas as a center for innovation. Blockchain's a bit different. Christine alluded to the token sale model. So all of a sudden, if you do have a concept and it's marketable, saleable, and you're savvy enough, you can actually raise the money peer-to-peer, which actually lessens the requirement for being physically located anywhere. If there are lots of examples of projects in Tel Aviv or in the Middle East where they raised a huge amount of money that the local VC community could never have supported, right? There's a project called Bancor, raised $140 million. They're based in Tel Aviv, and their contributors were from all around the world. Now, this is not an endorsement of Bancor. It's only to say that all of a sudden, it doesn't matter where you are, you can tap into this global pool of capital and talent and build a business anywhere. So I think that, going back to what I said at the very beginning, I do believe that this is the beginning of a second digital age, not just blockchain, but AI, quantum, and all these other things. And whoever, establishes themselves as the leader could potentially reap the benefits of decades of digital transformation. It could be Canada, but it could be anywhere else. And we actually did a ranking of cities all around the world, or locations all around the world, and who's leading. And there are some that are endowed with huge benefits.
Who's number one?
Silicon Valley.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. I want to give you the last word, Julie. So what should companies do tomorrow with this blockchain thing? It sounds like perhaps wait and see.
Well, they first need to understand it, and then they need to be rigorous in applying the criteria as to be whether a first mover. And always remember, if it doesn't have an ROI, it's not worth doing.
Okay, there we go. Focus on the ROI. So thank you very much for joining, sharing us your thoughts this morning.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you.